interesting how we're taught to think of Europe as a continent. Some consider it Eurocentric, especially when we think of it as separate from Africa and Asia. But can we even call Europe a continent according to traditional models that define what a continent is? We're still looking at the maps to expose the lies we've been taught about history. Europe is said to be a separate continent because of its diverse historic, cultural, and political identity, not because of any clear geographical separation from Asia. Contrary to what we've been taught, Europe is not a separate continent. It's considered a continent because they said so. So let's dig deeper into this big lie. Now let's find out how the continents got their names. This comes from World Atlas. It says there are generally considered to be 7 continents in the world: Africa, Europe, North America, South America, Asia, Antarctica, and Oceania. North America and South America are sometimes considered to be one continent, simply known as the Americas. Similarly, Europe and Asia are sometimes grouped together to form Eurasia. There have been many discussions on the number of continents in the world, but few discussions about how the continents were named in the first place. So let's just focus on these 3, Africa, Asia, and Europe. It is said that the Romans gave Africa this name, and it was referring to present-day Tunisia as Africa Terra. Africa Terra can be translated to mean land of the Afri, the plural form, or land of the Afar, and that's the singular form. And there are other theories about the origin of the word Afar. Now, when it comes to Asia, supposedly this came from the ancient Greek. Initially, it was used to refer to the eastern bank of the Aegean Sea, but was later used to refer to the region of Anatolia. Before its extensive use, the Romans used it to refer to the Lydian area. The deeper meaning could have been from the Aegean word asis, meaning muddy, or the Semitic asu, meaning light or rising. Now, the name Europe, the origins of this name came from the Latin word Europa, which traces its origins to the Greek language. One school of thought argues that the name traces back to the ancient Greek mythology. In Greek myth, Europa was the daughter of a Phoenician king by the name of Agenor or Phoenix. Europa fell in love with Zeus and had 3 sons. So what was the original name of Africa? According to this World Atlas article, it says the original name was Alkebulan. It says the name translates to mother of mankind. According to other sources, it translates to the Garden of Eden. It says Alkebulan is an extremely old word, and its origins are indigenous. Many nations in Africa use this word, including the Ethiopians, Nubians, Moors, and Numidians. So Alkebulan is not the only name that has been used for the continent. There were others, like Ethiopia and Libya. The article goes on to say, so how exactly did the continent get the name Africa? It says there are several theories that try to answer this question. The most commonly accepted theory states that the name came from the Romans when they discovered land on the opposite side of the Mediterranean. They called this land after a Berber tribe that was living in the Carthage area at the time. According to many sources, the name of that tribe was Afri. It says originally, the Romans supposedly called the continent Afri Terra, which was later transformed into Africa. Now this brings us to another term, Afro-Eurasia. Well, what exactly is Afro-Eurasia? It's referring to a supercontinent with the largest landmass on Earth. There are various names for it to include Afrasia and Euphrasia. This supercontinent was made up of parts of Africa, Europe, and Asia joined together at the Isthmus of Suez. The article says when joined together, you're looking at 85% of the world's population. It says Afro-Eurasia was also known as the Old World, as opposed to the Americas, Australia, and Oceania, which are known as the New World. As we know, names changed when the Indo-Europeans came on the scene. Well, Africa became known as the Dark Continent. Well, why did they call it that? I think we all know why. But let's look at this from ThoughtCo. The article begins by saying that the common answer to the question about why Africa was called the Dark Continent is because Europe didn't know much about Africa until the 19th century. But it says that answer is misleading and disingenuous. Europeans had known quite a lot about Africa for at least 2,000 years, but European leaders began purposefully ignoring earlier sources of information to justify colonialism and anti-blackness. At the same time, the campaign against enslavement and for paternalistic missionary work in Africa intensified Europeans' racial ideas about African people in the 1800s. White people called Africa the Dark Continent because they wanted to legitimize the enslavement of black people and exploitation of Africa's resources. The article goes on to say that it is true that up until the 19th century, Europeans had little direct knowledge of Africa beyond the coast, but their maps were already filled with details about the so-called Dark Continent. So they had the information, but we're going to see that they began changing things and making things up. It goes on to say, during the Enlightenment, however, Europeans developed new standards and tools for mapping. And since they weren't sure precisely where the lakes, mountains, and cities of Africa were, they began erasing them from popular maps. Many scholarly maps still had more details, but due to the new standards, the European explorers, and it names Burton, Livingstone, Speke, and Stanley, who went to Africa, were credited with newly discovering the mountains, rivers, and kingdoms to which African people guided them. The maps these explorers created did add to what was known, but they also helped create the myth of the Dark Continent. The phrase itself was actually popularized by the British explorer Henry Stanley, who, with an eye to boosting sales, titled one of his accounts Through the Dark Continent and another In Darkest Africa. However, Stanley himself recalled that before he left on his mission, he had read over 130 books on Africa. So in addition to lying about the maps, imperialism was also a factor. This says imperialism was global in the hearts of Western businessmen in the 19th century. But there were subtle differences between the imperialist demand for African resources compared to other parts of the world. That did not make it any less brutal. Most empire building begins with the recognition of trading and commercial benefits that could be accrued. In Africa's case, the continent as a whole was being annexed to fulfill three purposes: the spirit of adventure and the entitlement white Europeans felt towards Africa and its people and resources they could claim and exploit. In addition, the patronizing desire to civilize the natives. civilize the natives in the hope of stamping out the trade of enslaved people. So it says writers such as H. Rider Haggard, Joseph Conrad, and Rudyard Kipling fed into the romanticized and racist depiction of a dark continent that required saving by strong and white men of adventure. So Africa was seen by the explorers as an erotically and psychologically powerful place of darkness, one that could only be cured by a direct application of Christianity and, of course, capitalism. So we also know the fact that they had dark skin was a factor in this. So geographer Lucy Giroux describes the stated and unstated belief clearly when he said Africa was seen as a primeval bestial reptilian or female entity to be tamed, enlightened, guided, opened, and pierced by white European males through Western science, Christianity, civilization, commerce, and colonialism. In reality, African people had been achieving great things in a variety of fields for thousands of years, often before Europeans did. Ancient African cultures were responsible for developing entire mathematical systems, charting the sun and creating calendars, sailing to South America and Asia long before Europeans did, and developing tools and techniques that even surpassed Roman technology. Well, where did the Romans get it from? It goes on to say Africa was even home to its own empires, notably the Zulu, as well as enormous libraries and universities in countries such as Mali. And this is why they tried to erase the information, you all. It goes on to say by the 1870s and 1880s, European traders, officials, and adventurers were going to Africa to plunder, exploit, and destroy its people and resources. Let's just say it the way Scripture says it. They came to kill, steal, and destroy. It says recent developments in weaponry gave these men enough military might to enslave African people and seize control of raw materials. So it was because of their weapons, the weapons of warfare. Esau conquers by the sword. It says a particularly severe example of this is King Leopold's Belgian Congo. When things escalated, Europeans took no accountability and blamed black people instead. The dark continent, they said, was what supposedly brought out, listen to this, the savagery in man. If it brought it out, then that meant that it was already there. Over the years, people have given lots of reasons why Africa was called the Dark Continent. Many people know it is a racist phrase, but don't fully understand why. The common belief that the phrase just referred to Europe's lack of knowledge about Africa makes it seem outdated, but otherwise benign. Race does lie at the heart of this myth, but it is not just about skin color. Calling Africa the Dark Continent further codified the association between whiteness, purity, and intelligence, and blackness as a pollutant that made one subhuman. This principle is exemplified by the one-drop rule. The myth of the Dark Continent referred to the inferiority that Europeans convinced themselves was endemic to Africa to further their political and economic agenda. The idea that its lands were unknown came from disregarding centuries of pre-colonial history, contact, and travel across the continent. We're going to look at excerpts from this book entitled The Myth of the Continents by Martin Lewis and Karen Wigan. And it's going to tell us that the original continental distinction was devised by ancient Greek mariners who gave names Europe and Asia to lands on either side of an interior waterway. They were basically designating the two great land masses of their world. Later they added Libya, that's what they called Africa, to form a three-continent scheme. This goes on to say the division of the world into two continents certainly forces one to recognize, as Herodotus did many centuries earlier, that Europe, Asia, and Africa are not separated in any real sense. Let's just pause right there. Europe, Asia, and Africa are not really separate continents. It was made to seem so, you all. This says geographers have always been troubled by this division. As early as 1680, the author of the English Atlas is quoted as saying, "The division seems not so rational, for Asia is much bigger than both of the others." It says, "Nor is Europe an equal balance for Africa." So several 19th century geographers insisted that Europe was but an extension of Asia. By the late 19th century, the old parts of the earth had been definitively named continents, with the separation between Europe and Asia remaining central to the scheme. Now listen to what was written in the Oxford English Dictionary that was compiled in the decades prior to the 20th century. It says, formerly two continents were reckoned, the old and the new, the former comprising Europe, Asia, and Africa, which form one continuous mass of land, the latter North and South America forming another. These two continents, and it's talking about North and South America, are strictly islands, distinguished by their extent. Now what's interesting is that the Babylonian map of the world depicts one landmass. This comes from Britannica. It says, a clay tablet produced between the late 8th and 6th centuries BCE depicts the oldest known map of the ancient world. Acquired by the British Museum in 1882 and translated in 1889, this tablet depicts a map of known and unknown regions of the ancient Mesopotamian world. It says the tablet depicts the world known to those in ancient Mesopotamia within a disk which is surrounded by an outer circle. The area between these two concentric circles is labeled the Bitter River, meaning the salt sea or ocean. Two lines run through the middle of the disk representing the Euphrates River. It flows from the top of the map to the bottom of the map and terminates where the map reads swamp and outflow in a rectangle below the river. So if it was one landmass, what happened? And this is where we have to turn to scripture. Let's look at this from Genesis 10:25. It says, to Eber were born two sons. The name of the one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. Now when it says the earth was divided, is it talking about it being divided in terms of it being mapped out, or was it one landmass and something happened to cause it to be separated into what we now call continents? Let's look at it from both angles. This is what many believed Earth looked like when the continents were together. So you would look at this as though you were in space looking down on the Earth. So at that time it was called Pangaea. This article from Live Science says Pangaea was a massive supercontinent that formed millions of years ago. At that time, Earth didn't have 7 continents, but instead one giant one surrounded by a single ocean. it says the explanation for Pangaea's formation ushered in the modern theory of plate tectonics, which posits that the Earth's outer shell is broken up into several plates that slide over Earth's rocky shell, called the mantle. Over the course of Earth's history, several supercontinents have formed and broken up as a result of churning and circulation in the Earth's mantle. And let's just say that Europe is not one of those continents. It goes on to say that this breakup and formation of supercontinents has dramatically altered Earth's history. So that was one way to see how the earth was divided. Now let's go back to scripture, and we also see how it was divided up in terms of the sons of Noah and their descendants receiving portions as their inheritance. So in a sense, the known world had to be mapped out for them to do that. Let's look at this from Genesis 10, 1 through 5. Now this is the genealogy of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and sons were born to them after the flood. The sons of Japheth were Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshach, and Tyrus. The sons of Gomer were Ashkenaz, Riphath, and Togarmah. The sons of Javan were Elisha, Tarshish, Kittim, and Dodanim. Now verse 5 says, from these the coastland people of the Gentiles were separated into their lands. The meaning of coastland is land bordering the sea. They were separated, meaning that was their assigned portion. Not only that, it says everyone according to his language, according to their families into their nations. Well, why wouldn't the people be speaking the same language? Because something else happened in the days of Peleg. This comes from Genesis 11, 1 through 9. It says, now the whole earth had one language and one speech. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. Then they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. They had brick for stone, and they had asphalt for mortar. And they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. So they didn't want to be scattered. They wanted to remain in one place. Verse 5 says, but the Most High came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. And the Most High said, indeed the people are one. They're in agreement. And they all have one language. And this is what they begin to do. Now nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Most High scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they ceased building the city. Therefore its name is called Babel, because there the Most High confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Most High scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. So what happens after their language was confused? The Most High scattered them. Now in the previous chapter we were told that they were assigned to a region based on their lineage. So they were forced to go to their assigned places after the rebellion. They were lifted up in pride, thinking they could build for themselves a city and a tower that would reach into the heavens. Well, when did this happen? In Peleg's day. Peleg is in the lineage of Shem. His name means division or to divide, and this is reflected of a major event that happened in his lifetime. Now, historically speaking, It is said that something major did happen sometime after the flood. It was the Ice Age. And interestingly, creationists and evolutionists agree that there was an ice age. So this information comes from Institute for Creation Research. It says the great flood of Noah's day accomplished a complete reworking of Earth's surface and an alteration of all its hydrologic and meteorologic systems. The Ice Age likely occurred soon after the flood, perhaps in the days of Job, for references to ice and snow abound in his book. See, for example, Job 38:29. It says Job didn't live in a glaciated area, but he evidently knew about icy conditions farther north. The key to the Ice Age was temperature, not cold, but warm. Ice comes from snow, and snow from moisture in the air, which in turn comes through evaporation, which comes from warm water. The flood oceans were quite warm due to the introduction of the huge volumes of superheated water from the fountains of the great deep, and they reference Genesis 7:11. And frictional heating by shifting continents. It goes on to say the Ice Age commenced and continued until the oceans gave up their excess heat and the atmosphere cleared. Water trapped as ice on the continents lowered the sea level by an estimated 400 to 600 feet, no doubt exposing the continental shelves. During the Ice Age, all the continents were probably connected by land bridges. What happened when the Ice Age ended? It says the volume of ice returned to liquid form and re-entered the ocean, raising sea level and drowning all areas near the ocean. It says today we find numerous remains of civilizations that evidently had been built in coastal areas soon after the flood. I'll drop down. It says Genesis 10:25 states that in Peleg's day was the earth divided. This certainly could not imply that in Peleg's day the Atlantic Ocean was opened up, for this would have caused another flood to rival Noah's. Perhaps what Scripture is saying is that in Peleg's day the Ice Age ended, increasing the volume of water in the oceans, raising sea level, drowning land bridges, and dividing the continents. Now let's go back to the idea of Europe being a separate continent. We're going to look at some information about Africa first, and then we'll get to that. This comes from Big Think. It's entitled Africa Uncolonized, a detailed look at an alternate continent. So it says here the map upside down to skew our traditional Eurocentric point of view shows an Africa dominated by Islamic states and native kingdoms and federations. All have at least some basis in history, linguistics, or ethnography. None of their borders is concurrent with any of the straight lines imposed on the continent by European powers during the 1884 through 1885 Berlin Conference and in the subsequent scramble for Africa. By 1914, Europeans controlled 90% of Africa's landmass. Only the Abyssinian Empire, modern-day Ethiopia, and Liberia, founded in 1847 as a haven for freed African American slaves, remained independent. Now it's showing a map of the continent from the north up perspective. And I want you to look at the red arrow. That's the connection between Africa and Asia. Clearly, they are not two separate continents. There's a land bridge there connecting the two. Now let's look at the connection point between Asia and Europe. Look at the red arrow. That white line is supposed to be the dividing line, except we can clearly see that there is landmass there. Europe is the continent that isn't. They drew an imaginary line and said Asia and Europe are two separate continents. So if Africa and Asia are connected, and Asia and Europe are connected, how can there be three separate continents? And then they added in the so-called Middle East. But what do you see here? Connected landmass. But if you tell a lie long enough, you all know how the rest of that goes. Well, you just put it in a textbook and call it a fact. This article from World Atlas says Europe and Asia share a landmass, making the job of separating them a bit complicated. The boundary between Europe and Asia is unusual because it's largely characterized by mountains and rivers. The boundary between Europe and Asia has been changed many times throughout history. I wonder why. It says boundaries between continents are somewhat a matter of geographical convention. The number of continents that the Earth is considered to have can range between 6 or 7, although the count can go as low as 4 when Afro-Eurasia and Americas are combined as continents. There are only 3 overland boundaries in existence. These boundaries include the ones between Asia and Europe, between Africa and Asia, and between North and South America. It goes on to say confusion surrounding the definition of the 2 continents leads to more geographers identifying 6 continents only by merging Europe and Asia to form Eurasia. The splitting of Eurasia into Europe and Asia based on the true definition of a continent is now put on record. The separation of Europe from Asia was the effort of European geographers and scholars who sought to separate their region of the world. As has been illuminated here, the border between the 2 continents has not been a constant thing. Rather, it's been a shifting amorphous line that is largely defined by convention rather than any specific physical feature. In other words, it's a continent because we said so. You all, we are not done with exposing the lies and the liars, but we'll have to end it here. Be sure to join me for the live this coming Wednesday at 8 p.m. Until then, if this message has been a blessing to you, please hit the like and share it. You're also welcome to subscribe if you have not already done so. We normally upload messages on Sunday mornings at 8 a.m. Yah willing. Join me next time.